Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We are reading the fifth paragraph of part 1. This paragraph is called The Ascent of Sacrifice 1. And those who are not familiar, first time here, you can find description below where the link to this chapter will be there, with which you can follow the lines we are reading. In our last episode, 73, we saw Aurobindo introducing us to the depth dimension. If knowledge gives wideness, love brings depth, and there is an exploration of depth into the cave of the heart. There is a great mystery hidden in the depths of our heart. The evolving soul, starting as a spark and emerging as a psychic being, that is the one that will open the key to the doors of divine love within us. We are mental beings. There is a tendency to prioritize mind and its rational intelligence and discard other faculties. And particularly, the greater love is not experienced. What we experience is the frontal heart, the false soul of desire. And that is something that tend to be obscure, problematic. Therefore, the mind tends to be on guard against it. But once we are able to penetrate beyond the surface soul of desire, surface emotions, we will discover something profoundly beautiful. A divine love that is closer to truth than the mind and its rational intelligence. But to discover that, there is an inward journey to come in touch with that. Now we are starting with episode 74, paragraph 18. As in the works of knowledge, so in dealing with the workings of the heart, we are obliged to make a preliminary distinction between two categories of movements. Those that are either moved by the true soul or aid towards its liberation and rule in the nature, and those that are turned to the satisfaction of the unpurified vital nature. So in the domain of the works of knowledge, we had made this categorization and start with that which is helping the liberation and expansion of the mind. The same way, the works of the heart, we need to do a similar categorization. Which works of love is directly moved by the soul within and nourishing the soul, and what type of activities of the heart is actually serving the outer nature, the desires, impulses, sensory cravings, the vital impulses. So that segregation we need to do early on through self-observation. Then we can discover, here is a nobler movement of my heart, and here is a movement that is more of a satisfaction of the vital ego, its impulses, desires, cravings. That is something we need to observe. So as in the works of knowledge, so in dealing with the works of the heart, workings of the heart, we are obliged to make a preliminary distinction between two categories of movements. Those that are either moved by the true soul or aid towards its liberation and rule in the nature. It's a liberation and rule in the nature, and those that are turned to the satisfaction of the unpurified vital nature. Unpurified. A vital nature, when it is not purified, is bound by the ego and its desires, its cravings, and outward turned and living on the surface, reactions. That's a very unpurified vital nature and troubled by anger, fear, anxiety, jealousy, lust, all kinds of stuff. And that degenerates the heart. And from there, we need to distinguish the movements coming from a deeper depth, moved by the soul, true soul, that will aid the liberation of the soul, so that the soul can come forward and rule the nature. And in that process, it will purify the vital nature. So this is something we need to clearly distinguish when we are looking at the works of the heart. That means works of love. But the distinctions ordinarily laid down in this sense are of little use for the deeper spiritual purpose of yoga. So there are distinctions laid down in the sense that of little use, but the distinctions ordinarily laid down. Let's find out what are these ordinary distinctions laid down that will not be of much use. Thus, a division can be made between religious emotions and mundane feelings. That's one of the ordinary ways of classifying our heart's emotions. Religious emotions and mundane feelings. And it can be laid down as a rule of spiritual life that the religious emotions alone should be cultivated, and all worldly feelings and passions must be rejected and fall away from our existence. This is one of the traditional approaches. You cultivate the religious emotions, and the normal worldly life and passions are to be put aside, not cultivated, or rather rejected. So thus division can be made between religious emotions and mundane feelings. It can be laid down as a rule of spiritual life that the religious emotions alone should be cultivated, and all worldly feelings and passions must be rejected and fall away from our existence. This in practice would mean the religious life of the saint or devotee alone with the divine, or linked to others in a common God love, or at the most pouring out the fountains of a sacred religious or theistic love on the world outside. So that in practice, this tends to be reduced into the religious life of the saint or a devotee. So all that is turned towards the devotion towards God, that is considered worthy of keeping, the rest to be discarded. That's the tendency when the ordinary approach is followed. So the religious life of the saint or devotee alone with the divine, it's an inner movement alone, inner movement of devotion within with the divine, or linked only to others in a common God love. So among the devotees, you relate in the common connection with the divine, with the God love, or at the most pouring out the fountains of a sacred religious and theistic love on the world outside. So when you are bringing it out, it is a sacred religious or theistic love on the world outside. That is what you bring out by your bhajans and singing around. All that is bringing into the world your love for the God. This is the tendency in a conventional approach to the movements of the heart turned exclusively to the divine, and the devotion to the divine, that alone is classified. But religious emotion itself is too constantly invaded by the turmoil and obscurity of the vital movements, and it is often either crude or narrow or fanatical, or mixed with movements that are not signs of the spirit's perfection. So this religious emotion has a tendency as a limitation, that it gets invaded by the obscurity of the vital movement. When it gets invaded by the obscurity of the vital movement, there is a tendency to be fanatical, crude, or narrow, which we can see how people get into this whole trip of my God versus your God, my religion versus your religion, and the whole vital imposition that comes with it, where there is no rational intelligence or philosophical reasoning brought in, but this is what my God wants. And my particular teacher says, or a particular sacred book is saying, and you get into a fanatic expression in life, mixed with movements that are not signs of a spiritual perfection. We don't see the signs of any spiritual perfection. This tendency, and especially with the absence of a larger wideness of mind's development, it tends to be very narrow and tends to be fanatic. Even it is, there is a devotional fervor, intensity turned towards God, serving God, God's will, but there is a tendency to become fanatical, crude, and narrow in its approach. It is evident, besides that, even at the best, an intense figure of sainthood clamped in rigid hieratic lines is quite other than the wide ideal of an integral yoga. So, integral yoga is looking at a wider scope of the action of love, an action that is not limited to the sainthood clamped in a rigid hieratic lines. And we see that happening. Religions, once a great master sets in motion certain religions, within the religion there is whole traditions of saints with a fixed mold, rigid hieratic lines, a mold that is cast, that gets formed down the line, and it become a fixed form through which this pouring of love for the God also tend to be limited, that unfolds. But integral yoga cannot accept that. That is not what we are looking at. It is evident, besides that, even at the best, an intense figure of sainthood clamped in a rigid hieratic lines is quite other than the wide ideal of an integral yoga. A larger psychic and emotional relation with God and the world, more deep and plastic in its essence, more wide and embracing in its movements, more capable of taking up in its sweep the whole of life, is imperative. So, we need to look at a larger psychic and emotional relationship with not only God but also with God. And this relationship has to be deep and plastic in its essence, something that is very flexible, not rigidly cast by religious rules, something that is spontaneously recognizing the presence and movements of truth and responding to it in the outer world as well as the inner. More wide and embracing in its movements. So it must be able to embrace the full complexity of life, wide and embracing in its movements, more capable of taking up in its sweep the whole of life. So all aspects of life has to be taken up. Though we start with segregation of what is the right movement that will enable the liberation and the growth and emergence of the psychic being as a starting point, but eventually it has to embrace the whole of life without limited by rigid rules and regulations. It has to be flexible, supple, all embracing. That's what is the requirement, and it is imperative in integral yoga. A larger psychic and emotional relation with God and the world. More deep and plastic in its essence, more wide and embracing in its movements, more capable of taking up in its sweep the whole of life, is imperative. A wider formula has been provided by the secular mind of man. Now, previous one was religious mind. Religious mind bringing in the devotion to the God and saint's life as ideal, and the relationship among the devotees. And that part alone was encouraged. The rest of the life kept aside. That was the tendency of the religious mind. Here is the secular mind. What does the secular mind do when it comes to the action, activities, works of the heart? A wider formula has been provided by the secular mind of man, of which the basis is the ethical sense. So the mind brings ethics, ethical sense. For it distinguishes between the emotions sanctioned by the ethical sense and those that are egoistic and selfishly common and mundane. So the ethical sense within us can distinguish between emotions that are selfish and emotions that are wider, nobler. That distinction is allowed. Things like serving the poor, helping the people, serving the vaster cause, all that, and that emotion turned towards that is discerned by the ethical sense. Doing things just for your own personal benefit, that is discouraged by the ethical sense within us. So a wider formula has been provided by the secular mind of man, of which the basis is the ethical sense. For it distinguishes between the emotions sanctioned by the ethical sense and those that are egoistic and selfishly common and mundane. It is the works of altruism, philanthropy, compassion, benevolence, humanitarianism, service, labor for the well-being of man and all creatures that are to be our ideal. This is how the mind, as the mind develops, it develops the principles of ethical conduct and ethical sense. Out of that, in its development, this is a natural consequence. Altruism. That's one of the first thing ethics brings. Be altruistic. Then philanthropy. So we can see that very commonly. So among like people who generate wealth, a lot of wealth, then they start a philanthropic arm of generous donations to various social causes. So the altruism, philanthropy, compassion is brought out in the form of compassion for all people, especially the weak section of the society, and supporting their growth. Benevolence for them, humanitarianism, all that are in the similar categories, and service, labor for the well-being of man and all creatures, so taking care of the animals, birds, ecosystems, all that naturally comes from the ethical development that unfolds with the mind and its development. So it is the works of altruism, philanthropy, compassion, benevolence, humanitarianism, service, labor for the well-being of man and all creatures that are to be our ideal. To shuffle off the coil of egoism and grow into a soul of self-abnegation that lives only or mainly for others or for humanity as a whole is the way of man's inner evolution according to this doctrine. So forget about you and the limitation of your ego. You have to get out of the ego and serve the larger life, larger society, humanity, and make your personal selfish motives to vanish. Instead, you serve humanity. That is the ideal set by the ethical sense within us. So shuffle off the coil of egoism, that binds us in its limited movement, and grow into a soul of self-abnegation, forgetting yourself, becoming grow into a soul of self-abnegation that lives only or mainly for others, serving others, or for humanity as a whole, is the way of man's inner evolution according to this doctrine. So some religions make it into a major tenet of their outer activity, that is humanitarianism. Also, we see it happening in the larger society, in the business class in particular, who generate huge amount of money. Humanitarianism, funding the welfare activities and serving that as the higher ideal, and setting up social enterprises, all that are part of it. That is beautiful, well and good, but that is not what integral yoga is demanding from us. Or if this is too secular and mental to satisfy the whole of our being, since there is a deeper religious and spiritual note there that is left out of account by the humanitarian formula, a religio-ethical foundation can be provided for it, and such was indeed its original basis. So those who start with purely an ethical foundation, becoming the social service as an activity, they find it is insufficient, and then slowly bring in the religion into it. That's where it becomes religio-ethical foundation. And originally that was its nature. Later, when the age of reason came up, they say got separated. Then those who find themselves to be very rational in their development, they develop the ethical approach where humanitarian consideration, welfare of the whole world or larger society, especially the poor section of the society, people, animals, all that become part of it. But as they dive deeper into it, they realize there is something missing, some religious element is required. And then that is brought in, and then they come back together. The religio-ethical foundation can be provided for it, and such was indeed its original basis. This used to be religio-ethical in the past, then they got separated, then there's a tendency for them to come back together. So if this is too secular and mental to satisfy the whole of our being, since there is a deeper religious and spiritual note there that is left out of account by the humanitarian formula, a religio-ethical foundation can be provided for it, and such was indeed its original basis. To the inner worship of the divine or the supreme by the devotion of the heart, or to the pursuit of the ineffable by the seeking of the highest knowledge, can be added a worship through altruistic works, or a preparation through acts of love, of benevolence, of service to mankind, or to those around us. So an inner worship of the divine. So here again, it is only the inner part is taken up. Inner worship of the divine or the supreme by the devotion of the heart, or to the pursuit of the ineffable by the seeking of the highest knowledge, can be added to a worship through altruistic works. So altruistic works become a way of worship, or a preparation through acts of love. It becomes a preparation of benevolence, of service to mankind or to those around us. So there is an inner turn towards the God, divinity, supreme in things, outwardly still serving the poor, the benevolent activities to the mankind, serving mankind. So that's another level of that development. It is indeed by the religio-ethical sense that the law of universal goodwill or universal compassion or of love and service to the neighbor, the Vedantic, the Buddhistic, or the Christian ideal was created. So this ideal of serving humanity through various ways, even when your inner life is turned towards search for God and divinity, it comes from this religio-ethical sense. That is its foundation. A mind and human heart working together, turning on one hand inwardly to seek the divine, and outwardly serve the mankind. And we find it in the service of the neighbor, and this is there in the Vedantic, Buddhistic, and Christian ideal. So it is indeed by the religio-ethical sense that the law of universal goodwill. So goodwill turned towards everyone, a universal goodwill, not only people, but also animals, plants, creatures, everything. Universal goodwill or universal compassion or of love and service to the neighbor. The Vedantic, the Buddhist, the Christian ideal was created from that perspective. Only by a sort of secular refrigeration, extinguishing the fervor of the religious element in it, could the humanitarian ideal distinguish itself and become the highest plane of a secular system of mental and moral ethics. So when this secularists who tend to separate the religious movement, they have to do it by, he's referring to humorously, the secular refrigeration. You put aside that through secular refrigeration, extinguishing the fervor of the religious element in it. So the usual tendency was, it is the religion that brought in the service for the humanity as an ideal. And when the ethical mind develops, ethical dimension deepens, then there is a tendency to segregate the religious element from it by a kind of what he's referring to as a secular refrigeration, extinguishing the fervor of religious element in it. Could the humanitarian ideal disengage itself and become the highest plane of a secular system of mental and moral ethics? So that's mental and moral ethics, making the secularism clearly separated from religious dimension and making it into a universal compassion, universal love for all, and investing in that, which is a predominant tendency when the mind develops and the rational philosophies develop, and from there the ethical foundations develop. And then you look at the world, you clearly put aside religion, all the religious sentiment, and purely look from the point of view universal compassion and universally caring for all and becoming less and less selfish and serve the humanity become increasingly possible with that mental and moral ethics. For in the religious system, this law of works is a means that ceases when its object is accomplished or a side issue. So in the religious approach, this law of works is a means. The law of works is a means for realizing the God, contact with the God, love for the God. So law of works is a means that ceases when its object is accomplished or a side issue. So the work in the world is a side issue or will become secondary and not necessary when the original object, which is turned towards God and realizing the God, experiencing the God. So that's a tendency in the religious turn of things. It's a part of the cult by which one adores and seeks the divinity, or it is a penultimate step of the excision of self in the passage to nirvana. So on your way to nirvana, on your way to God realization, serving humanity become a means, and the need for it will end when you find your inner realization, or you put aside it, make it something secondary. By itself, it has not much value other than being a means to discover that inner realization. That's the religious formula that happens. In the religious system, this law of works is a means that ceases when its object is accomplished or a side issue. It is a part of the cult by which one adores and seeks the divinity, or it is a penultimate step in the excision of self in the passage to nirvana. In the secular ideal, it is promoted to an object in itself. It becomes a sign of the moral perfection of the human being, or else it is a condition for a happier state of man upon earth, a better society, a more united life of the race. So, these two, ethical approach and religious approach, in its original earlier stage, they are together. Religious and ethical works together. But as they develop, they segregate their way, and religion uses the serving of humanity as a means to actually search for the God and serve the God and liberate oneself into the God. Whereas the ethical branch, when it separates entirely, then it promotes serving humanity as an object in itself, an end in itself, and it becomes a sign of moral perfection of the human being. That is a sign of your moral perfection, that you care for the larger humanity, help the larger humanity, which is an indication of your moral perfection. Or else it is a condition for a happier state of man upon earth. That's how, when the humanitarian secular ideal, when it reaches its peak, this is how it would look like. This is a condition for your happiness of man on earth, a better society, a more united life of the race. So you go beyond the normal human ego and its egoistic pursuit of self-aggrandizement to supporting others. So the secular ideal keeps this as an object in itself, unlike the religious approach, which uses that as a means. Serving the humanitarianism is a means, whereas in secular ideal, it is an object in itself. But none of these things satisfy the demand of the soul that is placed before us by the integral yoga. So in integral yoga, neither religious approach nor secular approach is sufficient. This, we need to go beyond this, because the demand of the soul is something more than this. So none of these things satisfy the demand of the soul that is placed before us by the integral yoga. So we are not looking at serving humanity as an object in itself, as the secular ideal approach. On the other hand, we are not looking at serving humanity as a means to God realization, as the religious approach would put. Both are not what integral yoga demands from us. It is not the demand of the soul within us. Altruism, philanthropy, humanitarianism, service are flowers of the mental consciousness. We human beings are mental beings. When our mental consciousness develops and expands and enlarges, we develop mental philosophies. We see the logical need to really serve the larger life that is around. So all that are natural growth leading towards the birth of altruism, philanthropy, humanitarianism, service. These are all the flowers of the mental consciousness, and are at best the mind's cold and pale imitation of the spiritual flame of universal divine love. There is a truth of a universal divine love. Both D and love are capital here. And our mind imitates it. But it's a pale imitation. Mind is an instrument of cognition bound by ignorance, and yet in its deeper growth, it will develop philosophy. It will develop ethical, moral constructs. And it try to imitate the divine love. And out of that comes the birthing of all these flowers of mental consciousness, altruism, philanthropy, humanitarianism, service are flowers of the mental consciousness and are at best the mind's cold and pale imitation of the spiritual flame of universal divine love. There is a spiritual flame of the universal divine love, not truly liberative from ego sense. So this whole humanitarian approach, altruistic approach, serving, philanthropic approach, that doesn't liberate us from the grip of the ego, because it is still part of the mental consciousness. Mental consciousness is bound by the ego, and therefore it cannot liberate us from the ego. They widen it at most and give it a higher and larger satisfaction. That's the good it brings. It widens our mental limitations, our narrow self-interest. It broadens it, widens it at most, and give it a higher and larger satisfaction. This much it can do. Important in practice to change man's vital life and nature. So all our philanthropy, altruism, service to the poor, all that, it helps to expand a little bit of our heart, but fundamentally it cannot change our vital nature, nor it can liberate us from the mental ego. It gives satisfaction. In fact, it is so fulfilling to the human ego. I am so good, I am serving, I am helping so many people. And it can, in fact, even reinforce the ego. On one hand, it can reinforce the ego. Other hand, it is really fundamentally not transforming the vital nature, vital life and nature. Important in practice to change man's vital life and nature. They only modify and palliate its action and daub over its unchanged egoistic essence. It gives a nice coating, a beautiful coating. Look at this man, this woman, she or he is so helpful and generous in helping other people, doing so much altruistic, compassionate work for the people, for the society. So it gives a very nice coating, but behind the coating, your ego remains. In fact, even it might get reinforced. Look at me, I am so good. And second issue, it doesn't fundamentally transform our vital nature. It refines it a little bit, it expands it, but doesn't fundamentally change. And this is the issue. Or if they are intensely followed with an entire sincerity of the will, it is by an exaggerated amplification of one side of our nature. In that exaggeration, there can be no clue for the full and perfect divine evolution of the many sides of our individualized being towards the universal and transcendent eternal. So it is possible to intensely follow it with an entire sincerity of will. This tendency for philanthropy, humanitarianism, serving the world, it can be done intensely and with a complete sincerity. But when we do that, it exaggerates one aspect of our being, one part of our being, our human heart. It can enlarge and expand it. It's an exaggerated amplification of one side of our nature. In that exaggeration, there can be no clue to the full and perfect divine evolution of the many sides of our individualized being. So we miss out on the possibility of the evolutionary transformation that can be brought into our nature. First is individualizing, and then from there, universalization and discovery of the transcendent dimension. These things remain hidden and veiled. That is the limitation. We cannot evolve. The evolutionary transformation cannot happen. It can only bring some expansion. That's it. Some refinement of the ego. That's it. But ego sense remains, vital nature remains as it is. So if they are intensely followed with an entire sincerity of the will, in that it is by an exaggerated amplification of one side of our nature. In that exaggeration, there can be no clue for the full and perfect divine evolution of the many sides of our individualized being towards the universal and transcendent eternal. Nor can the religio-ethical ideal be sufficient guide, for this is a compromise or compact of mutual concession for mutual support between a religious urge which seeks to get a closer hold on earth by taking into itself the higher turn of ordinary human nature, and an ethical urge which hopes to elevate itself out of its own mental hardness and dryness by some touch of a religious fervor. So there are two fundamental urges within us. One is a religious urge. Religious urge turns towards God, but it has no grip on life on earth. Therefore, it has to find this humanitarian approach in it. Then there is an ethical urge which hopes to elevate itself from its own mental hardness and dryness, because the ethical dimension of us, ethical aspect of us, is born out of a mental development, out of mental consciousness. And mental nature is dry and cold in its logical constructs. So in its own mental hardness and dryness by some touch of religious favor. So between this ethical urge and religious urge, there is a mutual benefit, mutual concession. They collaborate so that the ethical urge can elevate itself out of its rigid, mental, cold, dry nature, and religious urge can, from its otherworldly search, come and connect with some connection with earth and earthly life. So nor can the religio-ethical ideal be a sufficient guide, for this is a compromise or compact of mutual concessions for mutual support. This religious and ethical urges are having mutual concessions for mutual support between a religious urge which seeks to get a closer hold on earth by taking into itself the higher turns of ordinary human nature. So the ordinary human nature has its higher turn, that is where it looks at helping other people. Otherwise, it is turned towards I, me, and myself. So the religious urge takes upon this higher movements in human nature. And the ethical urge which hopes to elevate itself out of its own mental hardness and dryness by some touch of a religious fervor. So these two parties find it a good collaboration to elevate both. Religious urge is able to get hold of earthly life, and ethical urge can lift itself out of its coldness and dryness. In making this compact, religion lowers itself to the mental level and inherits the inherent imperfections of mind and its inability to convert and transform life. So fundamentally, mind cannot transform life itself. So in making this compact, religion lowers itself to the mental level. That's one thing happens to the religion. It lowers itself to the mental level and inherits the inherent imperfections of the mind and its inability to convert and transform life. So fundamentally, human mind is a limited instrument. It cannot transform life. It cannot convert and transform life. This limitation will be inherited by religion. Religion has a innate tendency to turn towards the higher nature, higher possibilities in human, the turn towards the divine, but by this compact with the mental nature, it lowers itself and in the process it cannot fundamentally transform or convert the ordinary human life. The mind is the sphere of dualities. And just as it is impossible for it to achieve any absolute truth, but only truths relative or mixed with error, so it is impossible for it to achieve any absolute good. Human mind is bound by duality, right and wrong. It is always working within this formula of right and wrong. So, good and bad. There is no way the mind to arrive at an absolute truth. Therefore, it cannot arrive at something that is absolute good. It is bound by this limitation of duality where it has to segregate its experiences into good and bad, God versus evil. All that is brought in by the mind. The mind, in its sphere of the dualities, the mind is the sphere of dualities. And just as it is impossible for it to achieve any absolute truth, but only truths relative or mixed with error. That's what mind is capable. Only some relative or mixed with error. Truths that are relative or mixed with error. So it is impossible for it to achieve any absolute good. For moral good exists as a counterpart and corrective to evil, and has evil always for its shadow, complement, almost its reason for existence. This whole notion of moral good come into existence because of this very perception of the evil in the world. We can perceive certain dark forces operating through individuals who become really violent, evil, and because of this very existence of this evil nature, this whole ethical dimension is developed. Be good, do good. But mind is bound by duality, and it can exist only by classifying everything into these categories of good and bad, right and wrong, and fundamentally incapable of any absolute truth. Therefore, fundamentally incapable of any absolute good. It can only do some relative good mixed with error. But the spiritual consciousness belongs to a higher than the mental plane. And there the dualities cease. This is something very fundamental and crucial for us to keep in mind. Our human mind operates through dualities: right, wrong, pleasant, unpleasant, pain, pleasure, good, evil, the whole range, personal, impersonal. All that mind has to categorize everything into these separate boxes. And it cannot really see an underlying oneness where these dualities cease. Whereas the moment we rise up towards a spiritual consciousness, automatically these dualities will end because it is based on oneness of existence. Mind is not based on oneness. Mind is based on the division. Therefore, mind has to piece together, putting pieces together to create larger and larger whole. It is existing in divided consciousness and trying to fit small pieces into larger and larger wholes, whereas the spiritual consciousness is foundation is oneness. From there it can embrace multiplicity. The spiritual consciousness belongs to a higher than the mental plane, and there the dualities cease. For there falsehood confronted with the truth by which it profited through a usurping falsification of it, an evil faced by the good of which it was a perversion or a lurid substitute, are obliged to perish for want of sustenance and to cease. So falsehood is nothing but a distortion of truth. From the mind's perspective, this cannot be seen. Whereas when you arrive at a spiritual consciousness, you can see, look through the appearances of falsehood and see what was the original underlying truth of which the distortion became this particular form. That is possible for a spiritual consciousness. And from that point of view, there is only truth. Falsehood has no inherent reality. It is only a distortion of truth. And the moment you see the original essential truth, the bubble of falsehood will burst. Similarly, evil. The so-called evil is nothing but a perversion, a cruel perversion of something good. And human mind cannot see that original good. And there is only goodness in the world. This evil is nothing but a perversion, a distortion, a gruesome distortion of something fundamentally good. From a spiritual point of view, there is this truth and goodness as the foundation. Falsehood and evil are distortions, and that will be seen when we look at the world through the eye of the spiritual consciousness. Whereas when we see through the mind, living a mind that is living in division, which is bound by that divisive consciousness, there is falsehood and good as a two separate camp. Good and evil as two separate camp. And this is part of the nature of the mind. And as long as we live in the mental consciousness, this is bound to be there. But the moment we rise into the spiritual consciousness, these dualities end and the falsehood will cease the moment we are seeing the truth. And evil cease the moment we are seeing the good. It is from that point of view, the great sages have this universal compassion for all things in the universe. The spiritual consciousness belongs to a higher than mental plane. And there the dualities cease. For there falsehood confronted with the truth by which it profited through a usurping falsification of it. So the falsehood is able to exist only because there was an element of truth of which it is a distortion. So it was profiting by the underlying truth. And the moment the truth comes out, falsehood ceases. So falsehood confronted with the truth by which it profited through a usurping falsification of it. And evil faced by the good of which it was a perversion or a lurid substitute, are obliged to perish for want of sustenance and to cease. The integral yoga, refusing to rely upon the fragile stuff of mental and moral ideals, puts its whole emphasis in this field on three central dynamic processes. So in integral yoga, we don't rely on the mind and mental consciousness and all the limitations by which the mind is operating. So we don't rely on the mind and its limited consciousness. So the integral yoga, refusing to rely upon the fragile stuff of mental and moral ideals. Moral ideals are brought in by the mind itself. So the mental and moral ideals puts its whole emphasis in this field on three central dynamic processes. The development of the true soul or psychic being to take the place of the false soul of desire. That is the very first dynamic process that we look at when it comes to the works of love. We need the development of the true soul or psychic being to take the place of the false soul of desire. Our frontal soul of desire gets replaced with the true soul, the psychic being. That is the very first dynamic process we need to rely on. The second, the sublimation of human into divine love. This is a dynamic process that we need to consciously cultivate. Sublimation of human love to divine love. Third, the elevation of consciousness from its mental to its spiritual and supramental plane. So we need to elevate the mental consciousness to spiritual and supramental plane, by whose power alone both the soul and life force can be utterly delivered from the veil and prevarications of the ignorance. So these three movements will help us not only to liberate but also to fundamentally transform and go beyond the grip of ignorance and its activities. First, the development of the true soul or psychic being to take the place of the false soul of desire. Second, the sublimation of human to divine love. Third, the elevation of consciousness from its mental to its spiritual and supramental plane, by whose power alone both the soul and the life force can be utterly delivered. Our normal life force is bound by its limited activity. Similarly, soul gets entangled with all this. Both can be delivered and transformed from the veils and prevarications of the ignorance. Ignorance here, capital I, that's a whole lower range of consciousness. The mental consciousness, the vital consciousness, the physical, all are expressions of ignorance. And our soul gets entangled in it. So the soul can liberate and bring its true force and light into these instrument layers, purify them, transform them, which cannot be done by ethical means, which cannot be done by humanitarianism, all that are external outer forms of activity hoping to transform but fundamentally not capable of transforming neither the ego nor the distortions of the life impulse and its cravings and desires, all bound by ego. This can be transformed only when the false soul of desire is replaced by the emerging psychic being and its love. So then we are able to transform our human love into divine love and also lift ourselves beyond human consciousness into spiritual and supramental range. Then alone the true works of love can unfold and embrace the world. That is the possibility we are looking at. So Sri Aurobindo has extensively now covered the religious approach and ethical approach, and religious urge and ethical urge, their limitations and their tendency to work together for mutual benefit. All that has been vividly illustrated, and then he is saying this is insufficient. We need to really get into the fundamental shift, a central shift in consciousness from mental to the psychic, spiritual, and supramental. Without it, our integral action in the world, action of works of love and sacrifice of love in the world cannot be brought out with its fullness. So that is what we have now learned from this episode. So that's the end of today's episode. Kindly do click on the like button if you feel ready for it, because it will help in making this podcast more and more promoted by YouTube. It's part of YouTube algorithm where they see that this podcast is being appreciated. So subscribe, like, all that will help. That's your way of contributing to help this message spread. Thank you. See you next week.